Christmas, everyone. 2021. Merry Christmas. It's December 25th. It's been a challenging year for everyone, and hopefully you'll enjoy what I have in store for you. It's a bit of a treat, in my opinion. Today we're going to be looking at a magazine that is iconic. The article really changed the landscape of Sasquatch Bigfoot research. As you see on your screen, we're looking at the December 1959 issue of True magazine, the Man's Magazine, and on the cover we see a Christmas theme, which is apropos, and you see the title of an article that of course we're going to be looking at. It's called Just Found, America's Abominable Snowman. There's even some references to Christmas there, Christmas with VIP, there's a Christmas tree, some presents. Everything's got a Christmas theme because it's Christmas. Merry Christmas! Let's treat this like a Christmas present and rip her open and get right into it. Page 40. The strange story of America's abominable snowman. Somewhere in the wilds of California, there is a gigantic creature which walks on its hind legs, leaves huge human tracks, and is scaring hell out of everybody. What is it? Nobody knows. Yet. By Ivan T. Sanderson. Please note that there are a few mistakes in the article, and I may or may not point those out, but there's one glaring one where Sanderson, perhaps on purpose, calls Bob Titmus Bob Pitmus, perhaps on account of the fact that the men were not fond of one another. I will be reading the captions for photos as well, so I'll start with the first photo showing Ivan Sanderson with a cast. One of the world's foremost zoologists, Sanderson is also a widely traveled explorer, a veteran animal collector of both known and previously unknown animals, and a highly respected research scientist. His previous writings include close to a dozen books, the most famous being the classic Living Mammals of the World, and several articles for this magazine. California is a huge state and an immensely varied one. It is nearly 800 miles long, and it contains everything from barren deserts to lush tropical jungles. It is full of oddities and enigmas, ranging from almost active volcanoes to places where commercially minded proprietors assure travelers that something has gone wrong with good old, reliable gravity itself. California is always good for a story, and the rest of the nation is always willing to indulge in a big laugh at its expense. But there is one story that nobody is laughing at anymore. Before I continue, let's acknowledge the illustrations are by Louis S. Glanzman. For his first illustration, the caption reads, "According to Kerr and Brazil, the thing that sprang up in their headlights was huge, hairy, built like a human." Take a moment to enjoy the artist's work on page 41. Continuing at the bottom of page 40, and it may turn into the biggest thing to come out of that fabulous state since they found something yellow out at John Sutter's mill. On August 27, 1958, a tractor driver named Gerald Crew drove out to his job, which at that time was working with the crew pushing a new lumber access road into the uninhabited and only loosely surveyed territory near the borders of Humboldt and Del Norte, or if you're an old-timer, Del Norte counties in northwest California. Jerry Crew is a native of Saylor Township in Humboldt County. He is an active member of the Baptist Church, a teetotaler, and I have talked to enough people up there to state flatly that his reputation for honesty, level-headedness, and just plain common sense is an excellent one. The area where this road was being built is, surprisingly enough, an almost trackless wilderness. It is bordered by the Pacific Ocean on the west and Oregon on the north. Highway 299 runs along its southern border, and it stretches some 130 miles inland to Highway 99. It is crossed by one winding blacktop road and some lesser roads, plus an assortment of logging trails and jeep roads, which are used very rarely. While California is thought of as a heavily populated state, this particular section, encompassing some 100,000 square miles, has no known inhabitants at all. Almost anything could be living there, and nobody would be the wiser. If this sounds far-fetched, remember that it was only a relatively few years ago that a Stone Age Indian named Ishi, the last survivor of a race of men long believed extinct, walked out of the forest and surrendered himself to a startled slaughterhouse butcher in Oroville, California. Oroville is only about 65 miles north of the state capital of Sacramento, and a good deal closer to civilization than the remote spot where Jerry Crew found the first evidence of the snowman. Crew's crawler tractor had been left overnight at the head of the new road, about 20 miles north of the point where it branches out from the narrow blacktop that runs through the Hoopa Indian Reservation from Willow Creek to a place with the delightful name of Happy Camp up near the Oregon border. Jerry was an older member of the crew employed by a Mr. Ray Wallace, subcontractor to the firm, Block and Company, which had contracted with the Public Works Department on behalf of the National Park Service to build the road. Jerry is a local man. Most of his fellow workers were also local men and included, among others, a level-headed young nephew, James Crew, and 2 experienced loggers of Hoopa Indian origin. The country is extremely mountainous. As a matter of fact, in most places it is almost vertical, so that you can only go up on all fours or down on your bottom. It is clothed in a closed canopy of enormous spruce and other conifers, beneath which is a spreading subcanopy of broadleaf bushes and small trees, while the ground below this is covered with a mat of mosses and beautiful ferns. No matter how high you climb, the dense foliage and mountainous geography make it impossible to see, at best, more than about 4 square miles. The road on which Crew was working crawls laboriously up the face of the western wall of a valley that encloses the stream known as Bluff Creek. Now, before I continue on with the other half of this paragraph, why don't we look at the photos and the captions, since we have a page turn coming up. The top left photo shows Jerry Crew with the infamous cast, and it says, "The first real evidence was obtained when tractor driver Jerry Crew made this plaster cast of Monster's track." And below that we have 3 men examining a footprint. Further investigation at actual site proved creature stands up to 7 feet tall, weighs minimum of 750 pounds. Now continuing with the third line of the last paragraph. All along this mountainous trail there are stumps of vast trees cut and hauled out, and the great dozers and crawlers clank and roar in the hot summer sunlight as they gnaw their relentless way into this timeless land. Those employed on this work live, during the week, in camps near the roadhead. Some have their families with them and stay there all week. Others go home to nearby communities on Friday nights and return on the following Monday morning. Jerry Crew's practice was to return to his family over the weekend, leaving his machine parked at the scene of current operations. He had been on this job for 3 months before the eventful morning of August 27. What Crew discovered when he went to start up his cat that morning was a series of footprints that formed a continuous track to, around, and then away from the machine. Such tracks would not have aroused his curiosity under normal circumstances, because there were 3 dozen men at that roadhead, and the newly scraped roadbed was covered with soft areas of mud alternating with patches of loose shale. What did startle him, however, was that these footprints were of a naked foot of distinctly human shape in proportions, but, by actual measurement, a whopping 16 inches long. His first reaction was to consider them a hoax. Crew had heard of similar tracks found by another road gang working 8 miles north of a place called Kerbal on the Mad River earlier in the year, and his nephew, Jim Crew, had also mentioned having come across something similar in this area. Being a practical, matter-of-fact person, he felt considerably annoyed that some outsider should try to pull such a silly stunt on him. He told me that he suspected an outsider because, while his fellow workers liked a harmless joke as much as any man, he knew that this job made them far too tired to go clomping around in the dark, making silly footprints in the dirt. Then he got to thinking about this outsider and wondered just how he could have gotten there without being spotted passing the camps farther down the road, and how he had gotten out again, or where he had gone to. Jerry followed the tracks, and that is where he got his second shock. Tracing them backwards, he found that the tracks came almost straight down an incline at about a 75-degree angle onto the road ahead of the parked cat, then proceeded down the road to one side, circled the machine, and finally went on down toward the camp. Before getting there, however, they cut across the road and went straight down an even steeper incline and continued into the forest with a measured stride that varied only when an obstacle had to be stepped over or the bank was so steep a purchase had to be obtained with the heels only. The stride was enormous and proved on measurement to range from 46 to 60 inches and to average almost twice that of his own. Crew's fellow workers refused at first even to go and look at this preposterous nonsense that he said he had found, but eventually some of the men who had to go by that way anyway agreed to take a look. Some of them, Jerry tells me, looked at me real queer, but there were others who reacted differently. And before we continue with the last paragraph, let's look at the photos and the captions. Looking at the right side of the page, we have a subheading that says, "These creatures, once believed to be legendary, were found living today." And we have a photograph of a coelacanth, which was fished up in a dragnet off South America in 1938, was believed extinct for 70 million years. Below that, mandrill, left, an outsized monkey, is thought to be a relative of long-extinct dog bear. Mountain gorilla, right, was believed to be legendary until 1903. And finally at the bottom, Komodo dragons, once believed imaginary, were found in 1912. These lizards can be seen today in zoos. All of them, it developed, had either seen something similar in that general area or had heard similar tales from friends and acquaintances whom they regarded as reliable. Only the Indians present said nothing. Then they all went back to work. Continued on page 122. Nothing further happened for almost a month. Then, once again, these same monstrous footprints appeared overnight around the equipment and also farther down the road toward the valley and around a spring. Still, however, the matter remained a purely local affair for another 3 weeks, the details known only to the men working on the road and their immediate families. Then, in the middle of September, a Mrs. Jessie Bemis, wife of one of the most prominent and outspoken skeptics among the road crew, wrote a letter to the leading local newspaper, the Humboldt Times of Eureka, which said in part, "A rumor started among the men about the existence of a wild man. We regarded it as a joke. It was only yesterday that my husband became convinced that the existence of such a person is a fact. Have you heard of this wild man?" The editor of the paper, Andrew Ginzali, says that he at first regarded this letter with a thoroughly jaundiced eye. But the longer he saw it lying about his desk, the more it intrigued him, and finally he decided to publish it. He expected a storm of derision. Instead, a trickle of confirmatory correspondence began to come in from the Willow Creek area. Then, on the 2nd of October, Bigfoot, as the creature was now being called, appeared again on his apparently rather regular cyclical route, leaving tracks for 3 nights in succession and then vanishing for about 5 days. This time Jerry Crew was prepared with a supply of plaster of Paris, and he made a series of casts of both right and left feet. 2 days later he took time off to drive to Eureka on personal business, and he carried the casts along with him to show a friend. While he was there, somebody told editor Ginzali about him. When Ginzali met Jerry Crew and saw his trophies, he realized he had some real, live news on his hands. He ran a front pager on it with photographs the next day. Then the balloon went up. The wire services picked it up, and almost every paper in the country printed it, while cables of inquiry flooded in from abroad. The first I heard of the affair was a cable from a zoologist in Paris, who sounded slightly hysterical. I have done a good bit of writing on this general subject, and so I get a lot of esoteric cables about all sorts of things like sea monsters, abominable snowman, 2-headed calves, reincarnated Indian girls, and so forth, the majority of which I am inclined to look into because the world is, after all, a large place and we don't know much about a good deal of it. But this one I frankly refuse to believe, mostly because I rather naturally assumed that the location as given, California, must have been a complete error or misquote. It is all very well to have abominable creatures pounding over snow-covered passes in Nepal and Tibet. After all, giant pandas and yaks, an antelope with a nose like Jimmy Durante, and other unlikely things have come from thereabouts. And it is even conceivable that there might be little hairy men in the vast forests of Mozambique, in view of the almost equally unlikely but more or less hairless pygmies of the eastern Congo that are there for all tourists to see. But a wild man with a 16-inch foot and 50-inch stride tromping around California is a little too much to ask even Californians to accept. Of course, there have been similar reports of a like creature called a Sasquatch from all over British Columbia for a century, but then Canadians are still sort of foreigners, and also there are far too many Indian legends mixed up in their stories. The amazing thing in this California case was that the world press actually took it seriously enough to carry it as a news item. Not so the rest of humanity. One and all, apart from a few ardent mystics and professional crackpots, rose up in one concerted howl of outrage. Everybody connected with the business, and notably editor Ginzoli, was immediately smothered in a storm of brickbats. In the meantime, however, a number of other things had happened. Most notable among these was the reappearance of Bigfoot the night before the contractor, Ray Wallace, returned from a business trip. Wallace had heard rumors that either his men were pulling some kind of a stunt up in the hills or somebody was pulling one on them. And he was apprehensive, he told me, because skilled and reliable workers were not plentiful and, under the best conditions, the remote location was not conducive to the staying power of anyone. He suspected that someone might be deliberately trying to disrupt his operation, and he was determined to solve the mystery. Now, it so happened that Ray's brother, Wilbur Wallace, was also working on this job, and he, in addition to seeing the tracks many times, had witnessed 3 other startling occurrences. These he described in detail to his brother. First, it was reported to him by his men that a nearly full 55-gallon drum of diesel fuel, which had been left standing beside the road, was missing, and that Bigfoot tracks led down the road from a steep bank to the place where it had stood, then crossed the road, continued on down the hill, and finally went over the lower bank and away into the bush. Wilbur Wallace found the tracks exactly as the man had stated, and he also found the oil drum at the bottom of a steep bank about 175 feet from the road. It had rolled down this bank after having been thrown from the top. What is more, it had been lifted from its original resting place and apparently carried to this point, for there were no marks in the soft mud indicating that it had been either rolled or dragged. Second, a length of 18-inch galvanized steel culvert disappeared from a dump overnight and was found at the bottom of another bank some distance away. Third, a tire for a carry-all earth mover weighing over 250 pounds had likewise been in part carried and in part rolled a quarter of a mile down the road and hurled into a deep ravine. Even after hearing these things from his own brother, Ray Wallace remained skeptical. However, on his first morning on the job, he stopped for a drink at a spring on the way down the hill and himself stepped right into a mass of Mr. Bigfoot's tracks in the soft mud around the outflow. Ray Wallace is a hard-boiled and pragmatic man, and he was already experiencing trouble keeping his men on the job. Hand-picked as they were, quite a few had simply packed up and left. Wallace was convinced now that somebody was trying to disrupt his work, and this made him furious. In fact, he got so angry, he brought in a man named Ray Kerr, who had read of the matter in the press, and who had asked for a job on the road in order to be able to spend his spare time trying to track the culprit. Kerr brought with him a friend by the name of Bob Brazil, who had hunted professionally in Mexico, and who owned 4 good dogs and a British-made gun of enormous caliber, which considerably impressed the local people. Kerr, an experienced equipment operator, did a full daily job. Brazil did not take a job, but only hunted. Tracks were soon picked up and followed by them. Then one night, in late October, they saw it. They were driving down the new road after dark and came upon what seemed to be a gigantic humanoid, or human-shaped creature, covered all over with 6-inch brown fur, squatting by the road. They say it sprang up in their headlights, crossed the road in 2 strides, and vanished into the undergrowth. They went after it with a flashlight, but the brush was too thick to see anything. They measured the road and found it to be exactly 20 feet wide from the place where the creature had been squatting to the little ditch where it had landed after those 2 strides. Spurred by this encounter, they redoubled their hunting forays, but their dogs disappeared a few days later when they were following Bigfoot's tracks some distance from the roadhead. The dogs were never seen again, though a story was told that their skins and bones were found spattered about some trees. All this was, of course, taken with hoots of derision by everybody, including those in Willow Creek, who had not seen the tracks. There was one notable exception. Andrew Ginzoli of the Humboldt Times. He, accompanied by his newspaper's senior staff photographer, Neil Hulbert, visited Bluff Creek personally, found some fresh tracks, and photographed them. He also found something else. In following the tracks down the road, they came across a pile of feces of typical human form, but, as they put it, of absolutely monumental proportions. To be continued.
Please support this channel by subscribing and leaving comments. Stay well, stay safe. Here's wishing each and every one of you a wonderful holiday season. Merry Squatchmas, everyone!